You are watching Hillsborough Television, programming that keeps you informed about the services and activities of your county government.
Hello and welcome to Beyond Today, the program that addresses the future of our community through conversations with people who are working today for a better tomorrow. I'm Ray Charmonti, your host for Beyond Today and Assistant Executive Director for the Hillsborough County City-County Planning Commission. In today's show, we want to talk with noted land use attorney Dr. Bob Freilich. Dr. Freilich is a professor and author of leading case books in the field of land use planning and law. He is editor of The Urban Lawyer and serves on the advisory board of the Land Use and Environmental Law Review. His firm is recognized at the forefront of zoning and subdivision law, land use and litigation, and the development of comprehensive plans. We also have Bob Hunter, the executive director of the Planning Commission, with us. And I'm going to have Mr. Hunter kind of tell us how he came across Dr. Freilich at a conference that he attended.
Well, it was, I guess, a number of years ago. It wasn't just recently, but Dr. Freilich has a national reputation, and I think one of the premier cases that sort of set land use planning into effect was the Ramapo case, of which he was the attorney. And that really raised the issue on a national scale about planning and the legal status of zoning and planning. From there, he has worked essentially all over the country. But more recently, at a conference in Arizona, he was presenting from the University of Wisconsin. Out of about 3 days worth of presentations, he was on for about 2 days. And it sort of rekindled my thinking about where we are here in Hillsborough County. And we have an urban service area adopted, but what we're really looking at is trying to find a way to curtail and reduce urban sprawl, improve our quality of life as we continue to grow, and yet do it in a fiscally conservative manner. And maybe he just hit all the right buttons last summer, but we immediately started looking at how we might be able to bring him on board, and I think we were lucky enough to help us, the Planning Commission, develop an implementation element to Hillsborough County's comprehensive plan and recommend it to the Board of County Commissioners. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of what we plan to be in the implementation element because I think we'll be discussing it, but we have, I think, one of the most unique opportunities in Hillsborough County, especially where we are right now in our planning efforts, to hear from Dr. Freilich and take advantage of not only him working for the Planning Commission and the citizens of Hillsborough County, but here today to talk about some of the ideas that I think will really start saving Hillsborough County some money. I guess that's maybe the best introduction I could give on it, Dr. Freilich.
Dr. Freilich, I'd like to ask you a little bit about that case that Bob mentioned, because sometimes our citizens don't understand exactly what the legal ramifications of planning are. What was decided in that Ramapo case?
Well, it was very interesting, Ray. From the time that zoning came into being in the United States in the mid-20s, it's primarily been concerned about the use and density of land. So it tells you whether you can be commercial, residential, or industrial, and then it tells you the size of your lot, how many square feet per house, or how much floor area for a business, etc. But it never said anything about how that relates to the overall growth of the community. How do you grow from year 1 to year 10 to year 20? What areas ought to have priorities of capital improvements to go along with growth? What are the levels of service to make sure that we have a quality of life? And the Ramapo case was really the first. It was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1972, and it basically said that communities have a right to time and sequence their growth to the availability of adequate public facilities to service that growth. And so essentially it led to the opening of growth management in the United States. And curiously enough, Florida, at the very same time, had its very first ELMS committee, Environmental Land Management Committee, meet, and the first of the Florida laws on saving environmental land. Later on, the growth management legislation in Florida adopted basically the Ramapo system by requiring that counties and cities do comprehensive plans with adequate public facilities and concurrency, and making sure that growth is timed and sequenced and so forth. So it's had a major effect on Florida.
I guess Florida went from being a state with very little growth management 25 years ago to now, legally at least, being at the forefront, but I'm not sure that we've dealt with some of the issues yet. Now, I know in Hillsborough County, Bob Hunter mentioned the urban service area. Can you explain how that works from a planning perspective? Well,
I think that the concept of the Ramapo concept was expanded by a number of communities around the country, such as Minneapolis and Portland and others that are pretty well known, to essentially say how much growth of population and employment are we expecting in the next 10 or 20 years, and to create an urban service area boundary around that, so that urban growth will not spill over past that boundary. We can save our rural and agricultural lands. We won't introduce urban-type services of policing and roads and sewer and water and brand new schools, etc., to create urban areas, to have this intensified sprawl across the country. And what the reason of the urban service area is that we found that if you look at a city or a region like Tampa, the original city itself consumed usually about 4 units per acre was the typical growth pattern. And today you find that we're using 1 unit for every 2 acres as the typical growth pattern. So we're consuming about 8 times as much land per capita as we did in the beginning. And so the urban service area is to say we can become more efficient. Let's try to keep more growth inside and use that land before we go out and use others. But it has some serious problems if the only thing you do is draw one single line, and we can talk about that.
Let me ask you, is there any magic formula when you have a line and you talk about future population growth? I imagine each city handles it differently. How much, I guess you have an overcapacity, but how much is desirable, I guess?
Well, and I think that's right. I mean, I think the problem with having a single urban service area is that what you really intend to have for the whole future of the community forever, the permanent line? And obviously that doesn't make much sense because we really can't predict 50 and 100 years out. If it's only a 10 to 20 year line, then clearly we're going to have more growth beyond that, and how do we transition to that? So what a number of communities are beginning to do, and that's one of the things that Bob Hunter and I talked about, is to begin to say, let's have an urban service area boundary that goes out a 20-year period, but we don't want all the growth to reach out there immediately within 20 years. We want to have growth sort of sequenced out of Tampa, contiguous, but we also want to have other development patterns instead of just plain sprawl on large lots. Perhaps we can do some corridors following the major transportation routes and put interchanges at those corridors with major centers. We could do some of what people now are talking about, the neo-traditional movement, but they see that in Seaside, Florida, for example, where you have more mixed uses in a community and therefore reduce the amount of driving that you have to do. You can walk, you can actually walk to shopping and to other things and reduce the number of trips you do. So basically, by using corridors and centers and more contiguous development, you can really cut down a great deal on the sprawl. And so within the urban service area, you can then even have a future urbanizing area, something that you're not going to urbanize over the first 10 to 20 years. And you can begin to have a much better handle on how growth occurs, but still accommodating all of the growth that wants to come. I mean, developers should be assured of that.
One of the issues that comes up, I guess, with the tiering idea within the urban service area is the relationship to only water and sewer, but you're really talking about a more comprehensive relationship, I think.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that it's easy enough to extend water and sewer 100 miles because essentially they pay for themselves. They're very easy to extend those types of utilities. We have simple trunk lines and plants. Following with the sewer and water, however, are the really expensive services that always seem to be end up by being deficient. What happens is that fire and police and roads and schools, which take up 90% of the cost of urban facilities and services, they're more difficult to follow the sewer and water. And what is important to grasp is that the existing communities end up subsidizing a good bit of that fire and police and schools and so forth, because new development rarely pays for 100% of the cost of the facilities it generates. Some people use things like impact fees or dedications of land, but generally that may only come to a fraction of the cost. And then the general public has to pay the rest. And we never quite build that rest. So we keep we create new deficiencies, and we constantly are creating those deficiencies. So one of the things that's important about tiers in terms of contiguous growth and corridors and centers is we can expect development to pay for much closer to the full cost of the capital facilities and services they generate, and then we can spend that next 20 years eliminating those deficiencies that exist and getting back to where we really have the quality of life we want. And so it's a good long-term program for the county to be embarking on.
Bob, I wanted to ask you a little bit. I know one of the things you believe in is the need to have an implementation element in the comprehensive plan. I think you've probably been through 3 updates now since you came here. Can you tell us a little bit about how you feel this implementation element fits in with what Dr. Freilich's talking about?
Well, Hillsborough County has had its adopted plan since 1989. And we've had adopted zoning code and subdivision regulations and a capital improvement program. And I think it's become very apparent over the past 4 to 5 years, even with our updates, that that's not enough. It's not enough from the standpoint of the participation that we are receiving from the general public concerning the quality of life or how their communities are designed, how the new development is designed. The capital improvement program is not enough for everyone to get a better handle on the fiscal standpoint and what Dr. Freilich talked about paying fair share. I think the implementation element will sort of bridge the gap in between most of the comprehensive plan, primarily the land use and transportation, and what we call the county's land development regulations and capital improvement program, and that it will lead to improving those documents. And right now, as in many communities in the country, there's a gap there. And I think from some of our initial work, we're talking about a conservative deficit reduction program. While those are buzzwords, but it'll give us an opportunity, I think, as we continue to grow. Dr. Freilich mentioned that new growth rarely pays its full cost. And that's what we're looking at, is for the existing residents to not carry the burden of new growth. That new growth should essentially primarily carry its own responsibilities of cost. But the approach I think we're going to be taking is essentially no new deficits as we develop this implementation element, a way to enhance the revenues of the county instead of looking at the current way we do, increasing ad valorem or sales tax. We're hearing from the general public they don't necessarily want to do that. And then also using this to reduce the long-term county debt and the fiscal responsibilities within the county. And another one is reduced maintenance and operation. With those 4 key items in the implementation element, we think that will be a natural lead-in, we hope, to, instead of having 2 subdivisions develop 5 miles apart, if we can have them develop closer, we can service it better, and that's the concept behind the implementation element.
Right.
There's a lot of discussion, I guess, about the cost of growth. Are we getting to the point where we can really figure that out? I know there's been studies, but it would seem like we're as sophisticated as we're getting that we could come up with some computer programs that can do that. Now, where are we with this issue?
Well, I think there actually are some very well documented and excellent studies on the costs of growth in two different ways. One thing I think that's important is we are aware of the fact that sprawl, large lot development that just what I call the cappuccino cowboy development, which is where we all want to have a lifestyle. We want to be pioneers. The pioneering age ended in 1890 in terms of the frontier in America. But we want to essentially now, we make the metropolitan area our pioneer, our frontier. And so we all want to go out and to have a rural lifestyle, but we want to have urban services, and we want to be 10 minutes from a $100,000 job. So I call that the cappuccino cowboy syndrome. And there is a need to make sure that we have good, viable rural areas, and we maintain our agricultural areas, and we don't invade them and destroy the qualities of why people move to Florida and to the Tampa Hillsborough area. The costs of sprawl are pretty clearly evident. In terms of roads and transportation, if I've got 10 times as much land being consumed as I used to have when I developed, then obviously my road costs, my operation and maintenance costs, and my sheriff and police and fire and emergency costs on roads just skyrocket. And we know that, that by building centers and corridors and communities where you can do some walking to these places, will reduce those costs by as much as 60% without increasing taxes. I mean, that's one way of reducing the cost of government, is reducing the demand instead of just keep building more supply. The second thing is that there's always the question that people ask about, what's the cost if I ask housing or to contribute to the cost, as Bob said, of making sure that existing neighborhoods don't have to continuously subsidize new growth further out through their taxes. And what's very interesting is that it really doesn't increase the cost of housing. There are studies all over the nation and in Florida that indicate that what happens is it actually goes back and reduces the cost of land. The land has to contribute that public facility element. And so what you end up getting is more valuable housing at lower costs, and it really helps both the development community and it helps the community as a whole, so that we can then use the general fund, the sales tax, to eliminate deficiencies and to enhance life in those communities.
Now, how can you answer a person, I hear this sometime in the rural area, that says, well, I pay the same taxes, therefore I should have the same services. What is the answer to that question?
Well, I think one of the answers to that question is, why are they paying the same taxes? A number of communities around the nation are creating what they call urban service districts and then rural service districts, or the county is a general service district for county functions, the courts, for the system of social services, recording deeds and marriages and so forth. But when the county gets into the business of being the urban service provider for schools and roads and sewer and water, not traditional county functions, then basically that should be borne by those people that use those services. And I think most people in the United States feel that's the conservative fiscal way of dealing with it. If I use something, I should pay for it. Use or pay principle. And therefore, we should have more equitable ways of making sure that the people who use more water pay for the water, and not say to the person who's careful about the use of water, or they're careful about their trip patterns, or they live closer to transit and so forth, that they should just generally subsidize the far out development. I think that people who live in rural areas, in many cases, will very willingly say, don't bring me all the urban services. I want that rural quality of life. That's why I moved out here. And I don't want to pay for larger roads and more sewer and water out here. And I think that's some of the things that a tier system in urban service areas and corridors and so forth will basically give people a choice in Hillsborough County.
Now, when we talk about all these ideas, there's always the fear on the part of developers, oh, this sounds so regulatory. What ways can we do this that isn't so restrictive but more incentive oriented to make this happen?
Well, actually, I think the experience around the nation and in Florida, we've seen this in Sarasota and in Orlando and in Palm Beach and counties that have looked at this before that we've worked in, and in San Diego and Seattle, which are very similar type cities to Hillsborough, Tampa area. What we find is that it works in the sense that developers end up getting a far greater market for development opportunity. Instead of just having the single-family, large lot type of development predominate, there's more growth back in the central city, more growth in terms of corridors and centers. We try to attract economic development back to corridors and centers because there they don't have to do as much driving or trips. There's air pollution is lower. And we can actually assemble land, give incentives to computer companies, technology companies, lease it out to them, and get some revenues back on long-term leases that will enhance county revenue, but open up whole new areas of economic employment, which will take care of some of the deficits coming from residential. It also opens up terms of more multifamily and more townhouse and mixed-use type development. So developers will end up with 4 or 5 markets instead of the one. Just in San Diego alone, when they went into a program similar to this with a tiered system, they ended up with actually greater growth and multiple markets. But it was much higher levels of service, much better quality of life, and I think people are very happy with what they're seeing.
When did this urban service area concept, you mentioned Portland, but there are other cities that have this concept. When did this start, about 25 years ago? Or?
I think it began with Minneapolis in 1975 or 76, exactly, about 22, 23 years ago. And the major cities in the United States with that are Baltimore and Minneapolis, Lexington, you see Portland and Seattle and San Diego. So you see a number of the coastal cities that have it. Some of the inland cities too. That Denver is now thinking about developing that type of operation. And it makes sense because we just can't continue to grow endlessly outward without essentially facing fiscal solvency questions of a very serious nature. The entire quality of life will drop. Roads will become congested, air will become polluted from all these longer trips. Schools will become much more difficult to build because they're further out. School buses will be running endless miles. And neighborhoods will be declining, older neighborhoods, because constantly there'll be the push to the edge, to the rural fringe. I think people are really saying, we want to develop more communities, not just subdivisions. We want to get back to the kind of community life. We don't want everything to be the same. We still want to have outward growth, but we want to have an equal amount of growth where we have an opportunity for more economic jobs, for reviving our neighborhoods, and for seeing to it that there are different types of housing opportunities.
So you're really talking about this being a tool to help inner city areas also, not just suburbs.
Right. I think what you do on the outside, in many senses, is far more important than all of the things we've tried since the end of World War II to help on the inside. We've had programs of model cities and urban redevelopment and urban renewal, and you name them, and still the growth goes out and neighborhoods decline. From this very building, we can look out to the ice hockey arena and we can see acres and acres of parking lots. that are not filled with office buildings or jobs or research or technology. And if we basically say that these are high priority areas for capital improvements and that new growth is going to pay its fair share, and we want to have certain areas where we're going to promote economic development in corridors and centers and downtown, we're going to see that happen. San Diego, for example, did not have a single new office building over 10 stories from 1945 to 1979. That was a 34-year period. But from 79 to 80 to 97, 18 years, they've got 30 buildings over 20 stories. Because the incentive of saying, I already have my roads, my sewer, my water, my capacity, so I'm paying less than what I would be paying further out, creates an enormous shift in terms of, yes, I still have growth going out, but now I have growth coming back in as well.
How does this all fit in with this new urbanist movement or the neo-traditional development? Do you see it as a complementary movement?
Well, I see the neo-traditional development as being a piece of what you're trying to do. I mean, maybe 5% of the public will ultimately end up in neo-traditional type developments. But it essentially will allow people to, if they want to have a more interactive community life, so they want to have porches that face to the front and their garages to the rear, more pedestrian, they can walk to recreation, walk to shopping, walk to schools, have social community type recreation. There'll be some opportunities for that. Again, I think the important thing is this isn't designed to say to anyone, this is the way you're going to live. It's going to say, we're going to give you multiple choices. I mean, the market can make multiple choices and it will be a market-driven economy. But it will give incentives for the market to develop more choices. And that, I think, is all to the good for both the development community as well as for the people who are living here now and who will be living here.
Right. Bob, just a quick summary. How is this going to help our planning process in Hillsborough County and our comp plan?
Quickly. I think, number one, we're going to be offering an opportunity to provide more choices and to do it in a fiscal responsible manner where not only does new growth pay for itself and the people who presently live here aren't subsidizing it, but as Dr. Freilich indicated, more markets of which we think the development community, the business community should embrace. And so I look at it while we're just now introducing the concept, it's going to be for some long discussions, but I see it as really an enhanced opportunity for this community to really decide how it wants to grow.
Great. Well, Dr. Freilich, thank you for being with us today, and Bob, thank you also. Let us know if you have any comments about today's show. You can reach us at our hotline or on email as listed here. I'm Ray Sharmonti on behalf of the Planning Commission. I thank you for thinking beyond today.